What's up, noobs? Is Dragon Age the Veilguard story worth your time? Today, I'll dive into its narrative without getting distracted by gameplay, because let's face it, we're here for the drama. Or at least I am. And as someone who hasn't played the previous games, I decided that I wanted to review and play this game with a fresh pair of eyes, so I didn't do any research apart from watching the trailers before playing this game. The reason I decided to do that is, even though this is a part of a series, I think that any standalone game or movie should be able to stand on their own without prior knowledge of the story, especially when it's that long since the last game. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be serving the fans, but I think it should be more as Easter eggs, or that they in general will have a richer experience of the story, but that the main focus for this game is to have a proper beginning, middle, and ending that works by itself. Personally, I don't like the intro. I think it's too much backstory and too much info in one go, and I really couldn't understand or remember anything. Especially after spending hours in the character creator and then they suddenly continue right in the middle of the intro again. I believe in a show not tell storytelling style, and it's just too many new words, characters, and explanations, which at this point isn't even relevant. I feel like as a new gamer to this series, it's important to draw me in a way that makes me curious and immersed in the story, and a better way to do this, rather than telling me everything up front, is to reveal bit by bit as the story progresses. Not only is it easier to digest the information that way, but I'm also more intrigued and curious about what's happening. It's incredibly hard to start a story with a monologue of the history or the rules of a world, because the audience doesn't care yet. I'm not here for a history lesson, I'm here to be entertained, and for me to be interested in the world, I need to first be interested in the characters and the story that is happening now. I would rather it was like, wait, someone is performing a ritual that will kill a lot of people? Who is doing that and why is he doing that? Not knowing the why up front is much more intriguing to the audience, and I think people in general underestimate the power of mystery. I suspect they got caught up in trying to get new gamers to play the game, and they thought they would have to bring them up to speed right away, which I disagree with. A fantasy game that doesn't do this though, and I think reveals the world, the stakes, and the story in a perfect way, is Baldur's Gate 3. I have a video on that if you want to know why. I'm also not a big fan of the little chapter narrator bits by Varric. I mean, they do look beautiful, and I get it's about his whole love of storytelling, but my main irritation with them is that they keep spoiling what's going to happen. Like telling us what a villain has planned, or saying that the magic Harding possesses is bad for her. Like, I genuinely don't understand why they would do that, and what the intention is by spoiling the story for us. Why can't we just discover those things as we go along the way? Anyway, let's dive into the actual storyline. You're playing as Rook, depending on your background you've chosen. Circumstances have led you to travel with Varric and Harding, former Inquisition members, for a year, and you're here to stop Solas completing the ritual and destroying the veil. You succeed in stopping him, but the veil is partly broken, so the Fade, which is raw magic, spills into the world, and two of the gods, very powerful elves, escape from the veil and start wreaking havoc in the world. It also results in Solas getting trapped in a part of the Fade, which is connected to Rook because the magical dagger touches Rook's blood, so that Rook can communicate with Solas in their mind. So this is a lot and very complicated. But aside from that, I actually think this is really cool. I think starting off a story with a grand event is really effective in drawing people in and dazzling them straight away. And Rook trying to stop someone from doing something bad because they think it's the right thing, but then that resulting in something awful for the world, are also great stakes. Rook has started off the story by making a big mistake, which now they feel the responsibility for correcting. The biggest issue for me is that Rook's personal stakes feel too distant and abstract. If Solas goes through with this, a lot of people will die. It's a grand idea, but it's hard to connect with emotionally. Compare that to Baldur's Gate 3, where the immediate personal threat of becoming a mindless monster hooks you right away. In Veilguard, Rook's investment feels shallow, beyond being Varric's friend or the generic hero type. There's little driving them to risk everything. I wish Rook had felt more guilt and responsibility for disrupting the ritual. They're sad about Varric being hurt, but they never fully reckon with the consequences of their actions, like the Evanuris escaping or the Blight. Imagine how much more compelling it would be if Rook genuinely wrestled with the weight of their mistake, blaming themselves for every life lost. That kind of inner conflict would make them a richer, more nuanced character. In general, Rook's rigid moral perspective is dull. The story missed opportunities to let players define who Rook is based on their chosen background. For example, I played as someone from the Lords of Fortune, basically a pirate, and they wouldn't be your typical selfless hero, but they could have a conscience driven by guilt or the desire to make things right. This could also parallel Solas's guilt, creating a stronger connection between them and adding layers to the story. So, because the story starts off with such an explosive and powerful beginning, the rest of Act 1 feels incredibly slow. After the initial setup, you have to gather your team and you start getting to know the different cities and political powerhouses. It just feels like one really long introduction where I was mostly just waiting for the story to start. I also think it took way too long before the whole team was gathered, and it's just so many people and locations you're introduced to, it's hard to feel invested in everyone. I also initially really liked the part where you had to choose to save either Minrathous or Treviso, but then I realized that it wasn't that much of a choice because we were splitting the party anyway, so I don't understand why Nev got so upset when I chose Treviso because the other party members were there to help. Rook is established as the team leader, not the strongest person in the party, and they made such a big deal about it too that to me it just felt like a really big plot hole. One of the most awkward scenes in the whole story is at the end of Act 1 when everyone sits down and decides that we have to finish each other's side quests and pause on the main quest. The conversation was so outright gameplay fixated, it was jarring to me. It painfully made me aware that this was a game and took me out of the story immediately. I didn't even get from the story that they were also distracted in the first place. Were they implying that Lucanus missed on killing the god because he was thinking about Treviso? If Spite was the case, I wish that Spite had actually messed it up for him, so that to the party he'd actually be unreliable until he fixed his Spite problem. Then it would be very obvious to me that we would have to deal with that, but the worst was really how they'd written the conversation, like they even have Varric saying in which order you should do the side quests. Is that really necessary? I generally felt there was very little emotion from everyone except Davrin and Lucanus being a bit defensive. Imagine if the scene escalated into everyone breaking out in a full-on loud argument and Rook had to yell at them to be quiet, then we'd really get the sense that they weren't a team that trusted each other yet and that Rook would have to fix that. I generally think the dialogue is mostly very horribly written. Like that scene, it's either painfully obvious with no subtext, incredibly awkward, or it just doesn't make much sense and doesn't sound like a natural flowing conversation. One thing I really love about Act 1 is how Solas starts as the villain, but then shifts into an uneasy ally to take down the gods who have now become the true villains. You're forced to collaborate out of necessity, but there's always that nagging tension, will he help you or will he betray you? This slow burn uncertainty lingers in the back of your mind, building a delicious tension that promises to pay off in Act 3. But honestly, I don't think they took enough advantage of that tension, connection, and the story with Solas. Although I love that when you move into Act 2, you start seeing his memories and interacting with them, I think they could have taken advantage of Solas and Rook's connection even more. That Solas was always observing and maybe providing commentary on certain cutscenes or even seeing a reflection of him in certain parts where the fade is strong. That would make their connection stronger and the betrayal in Act 3 later feel even worse. So the big problem with Act 2 is that we're pausing on the main quest to finish side and companion quests, which means we are just pausing on the whole story for a very big chunk of time, which is incredibly boring. Act 2 is almost entirely just filler episodes, and I wish I could say I love the companion quests, but I found them incredibly lacking, and I'll make a separate video on that later. But if we only look at what happens in Act 2, the siege on Weishaupt, the undercover Venatori mission, and rallying the forces is really cool. It's just a very small part of Act 2. And I have to say that throughout the game, I love how incredibly grand it is. I've never seen a game that has so many epic and action-filled cutscenes, and I'm absolutely here for it. It really made me feel the high stakes, the chaos of the moment, and it was just cool and refreshing to see Rook and the party in action, as there are a bit too many cutscenes that are just people standing around explaining things for a very long time. And especially as we move into Act 3, it just gets even more epic. So now you've finished your companion side quests, making them heroes, and you've helped out the different factions so that you can get help from them in the final battle. And it's at the beginning of Act 3 I finally got really excited and invested in the story, which I hadn't been at all in Act 1 or 2, which is a shame and a fail. I think this is because now I'm actually wondering what's going to happen, which before is just an awful lot of tasks I have to fulfill and a lot of backstory to catch up on and political intrigue to understand while waiting for the story to happen. I think the eclipse is the perfect backdrop for such a dramatic event, and I love the decisions you have to make of which party members should do what, putting them at risk. And I really love that one of the party members actually had to die in order for them to be able to kill one of the gods, and all in the name of whatever it takes. Because that is basically the same mentality that Solas has. Sacrifices in the name of the greater good, whatever it takes, must be made. And I think it's a great storyline and in line with the character that Solas takes advantage of that. That he betrays you and traps you in the Fade, and that Rook has to go through their own guilt to escape. But I hate that the second you escape, you just go straight into a cutscene sitting around the table and talking strategy instead of seeing the companions' reactions as you are saved and emerge from the Fade. It felt a bit abrupt and disjointed. But the Varric twist I loved. I usually pick up on these things, but this one I didn't see coming, and that usually bugs me a lot. And often that is because it is a twist with no hints in the story, and that feels like cheating. But this time it was because Solas made Rook see that Varric was saved on purpose, so it makes sense why we couldn't know, and why I accept it. What's funny is that throughout the game I was thinking that I felt that they hadn't exploited the Varric character enough, that he felt so flat and sidelined, and I was going to critique the story because I couldn't understand why he wasn't still leading the team. Even if he was injured, he could just do it from the lighthouse. But the only point that bothers me about it is that I find it hard to believe that Rook wouldn't talk about Varric in some way that would make people suspicious and reveal earlier that he's dead. But other than that, I love a good twist. It also makes it more justifiable for Rook to be angry at Solas if the player chooses that option. One thing that would have been good though if we knew Varric was dead from the start is that we would really feel the heavy burden of the fate of the world on Rook's shoulders and the mission and legacy Varric left behind. Because Varric was there to support and guide them, I didn't feel it that heavily, and I think that would have contributed to a stronger character arc for Rook and also for us to feel a bit more compassion for them. But continuing on the story, I love the strategizing you have to do with the different factions and companions as you go to war, that you meet up with Solas and you have to work together again, and he fights the dragon as the Dreadwolf. That they are fighting as you are walking around just looks so epic. And of course, I love Solas being his trickster self and promising he won't tear down the veil because he knows Rook killing the last god results in the veil being torn down anyway. That seems very fitting to his character, and it adds another dimension to the plot. What I don't understand is why do they have to kill Elgar'nan? Why can't they just bind him to the veil like Solas did before? Then they would screw up Solas's plan of tearing down the veil, and Solas wouldn't have to be sacrificed. Although I guess this story insists on Rook wanting to sacrifice Solas no matter what, I just don't understand why this wasn't an option or not even mentioned. That seems like a plot hole to me. So let's talk about the 4 endings, which is really just one ending. So no matter what you choose, if it is to trick him, persuade him, or fight him, it all ends in the same way, that Solas is bound to the veil forever, keeping it intact. Maybe I'm biased because I've become a Solas fan, but if we look at the theme of this story, it's about guilt and how difficult it is to make the right choices, even when we are trying to do good. That is the theme for Solas, and it is the theme for Rook as a new leader, making choices that lead to tragedies, but in the hope of doing it for the greater good. And what is the ending of this story teaching us? That we need to be punished and atone for our mistakes, even if they were intentionally good? I don't know if I'm just crazy, but I kind of agree with Solas about tearing down the veil, and I really wish that was an option to the story. The veil is something that is unnatural to the original world because it was constructed by Solas. To me, it sounds like the world will always be working to tear down the veil, whether by it naturally weakening over time or someone else wanting to do it. The veil was supposed to be a temporary solution to keep the gods at bay, and keeping it up is just postponing the inevitable. Yes, it's terrible that people will die, but ultimately people are dying anyway. Because of the veil, the fate has been cut off from the world, and the elves can no longer live forever, so inadvertently, every elf that dies from old age is Solas's fault. Imagine being an elf that should have been able to live for hundreds or thousands of years. Wouldn't that kind of piss you off? I'm surprised no more elves are on Solas's side. Because from what I gather, what are really the known consequences of tearing down the veil? That there are some evil spirits that will disrupt the world and kill some people, but then there are also good spirits and everyone could be living along with magic from the Fade as originally intended. Maybe I'm secretly a villain because I agree that a few sacrifices might be worth the rest of the future of the world. If the story insists on keeping the veil intact, it needed to show why tearing it down would be so much worse. What makes this story compelling is the exploration of the morally gray areas, where there's no clear right or wrong, and that every great change comes with sacrifice. The story touches on several interesting questions, like whether the intentions behind our actions truly matter, but it doesn't really explore them at all. Solas and his arc had the potential to challenge our understanding of justice, showing how subjective it really is. Instead, they insist on this single, rigid ending that just doesn't fit the moral ambiguity they were building up to. It doesn't just feel incomplete, but also disappointing. They end the story by saying that all good stories end with change. Except this one? They kept the veil intact, so really there was no change to the world. They were too scared of what could go wrong that they missed out on what could be even better by clinging to what they have now. Sadly, that is what I get from the story how it is now. So what was the ending with Solas? Because I'm trying to dissect what really happened and I'm still unsure where he was actually disappearing to. First, I thought that because he sees this as atonement, and in the romance with the Inquisitor he says that where he's going is terrible, so I assumed he was going the same place as the Vanoobie was, in a metaphysical realm cut off from the Fade. But then I'm thinking, why would he do that? He put the Vanoobie in the metaphysical realm because they drew their power from the Fade, so they wouldn't have power anymore. But why would he need to go there? He could just be in the regular Fade, right? And if he actually is in the regular Fade, doesn't he love that? Then his atonement wouldn't be as bad because at least he's somewhere he feels he belongs. So then the atonement is to be alone forever. But then, why would he say to the Inquisitor that where he's going is terrible? I just don't really get it, but if anyone does, please let me know. The ending where a romanced Inquisitor joins Solas doesn't make much sense to me. Sacrificing their entire life for him, 10 years after he betrayed them, feels like a stretch. I can buy that Solas still loves the Inquisitor. He's an ancient, lonely elf, and 10 years is nothing to him. But for the Inquisitor, even if they're an elf, it's hard to believe they wouldn't have moved on, or at least hesitated to leave everything behind for someone they never truly shared a full relationship with. The Inquisitor says we make this journey together always, but they've never truly been part of the journey. They weren't with him as the Dreadwolf, never had the chance to love all of him or be part of his burden. While I love the idea of them getting a resolution, this ending feels too extreme for the relationship they had. Don't kill me, Solavelans. And I think it's a shame that Rook doesn't get to romance Solas. Him being in Rook's head, they could have gotten to know each other really intimately, really fast, and I think him betraying Rook would have an even bigger impact on the story emotionally, having Rook questioning if the love was real or not. I don't see why this couldn't have been an option if you choose that the Inquisitor romanced someone else. They must have known that people wanted it? Anyway, another thing that irks me with the ending where you fight Solas and he yells that he's a god feels out of character. He despised the Vanoobie for their godlike arrogance, so framing him as becoming what he hated doesn't land, because it's way too abrupt. A more fitting reaction is when you swap the dagger. I believe him saying, "You're merely a mortal," in a desperate, prideful way and not out of true superiority. I also think it is strange that they are framing it as that he wants to destroy the veil because it is the world Mythal wanted, when I think it is obvious that it is the world he wanted, and it's about correcting his own mistake in removing the Fade from the world. He loves the Fade and thinks the world is unnatural the way it is now. That is why he wants to destroy the veil. Yes, Mythal influenced him in many of the choices he made that he regrets. But creating the veil was his own choice and idea, even if it was to avenge Mythal. I do like what she says to him in the end, that she exploited him and his wisdom and it broke him, because in ways I think it did. But I think it is also the fact that he let himself be persuaded by her to do it anyway, even when he always warned her that this was wrong. Exactly like the ending now. Solas, the spirit of wisdom, yet no one ever listens to him or his advice, and he never gets to fulfill his own desires. The ending now, where he is tied to the veil and sacrifices himself, willingly or not, I like as one optional ending, not the sole ending. I'm wondering if the only reason tearing down the veil isn't an option is because they're trying to set the scene for a new game coming later, which I think is a bad reason for the story, and honestly, I think that would be a lot more interesting game. Navigating and exploring the world of Thedas as a new world with the Fade. The best ending, one that truly honors the story's themes, would be Solas tearing down the veil, with Rook killing him at that very moment. The world erupts into chaos as the Fade spills out with spirits and magic everywhere. Years later, we see the world thriving because of the Fade. Solas was right all along. Rook, at a Dread Wolf statue, confesses their regret for killing Solas, finally understanding his struggle. Rook reflects on the companions and factions, showing clips of how everyone has moved forward, and with their romance, of course. And now Solas becomes the hero he always wanted to be, but only in death. Now that is a bittersweet ending, giving a character a proper arc. He sacrificed himself to do what no one else dared, what no one believed in or could see was right, for the world and everyone in it. And history remembers him as a villain, but the Veilguard would know the truth. And then a secret cutscene could show a spirit of wisdom near the Dreadwolf statue, hinting that Solas heard Rook's confession. That would have been beautiful. The ending we have now, I don't think is beautiful. It is tragic without a proper arc or a meaning or change, so it just feels unjust and hollow. The story I'm proposing, while not perfect, would conclude Solas' arc and story in finally trusting his own judgment and wisdom and going back to being a spirit like he always wanted. Rook's arc would only feel satisfying if they mirrored Solas' arc. After making sacrifices for the greater good, they could become consumed by it or surpass him by forgiving both themselves and Solas, not just themselves like it is now. I think the Inquisitor's line of "I forgive you" would be more fitting for Rook, actually, and it would be even better with a romanced Rook. Punishing Solas by tying him to the veil feels unjust. Instead, it would make more sense if Rook was bound to him by the dagger, for instance, and chose to share in that atonement, taking equal responsibility for their actions. So actually, when I think about it, both of their arcs should have been about forgiveness. Instead, Rook doesn't even have an arc, and Solas, after millennia of guilt and trying to correct his mistakes, he has to yield again to everyone else's idea of what is right and suffer with more guilt for eternity because of it. So, that was a lot to unpack, and what does this leave us with? That the theme of Dragon Age the Veilguard is guilt is intent relevant, making morally gray decisions in the name of the greater good, but in the end, never honors this sentiment. To wrap it up, the story's conclusion didn't quite work for me, but it wasn't all bad. It's a shame they couldn't shape it into something great, especially with such potential in the world and characters. Was it the studio, the moneymakers? I don't know, but it's not working. And yet, I'm still invested. The fact that this story provoked such a strong reaction means it's not entirely bad, because if it was, I wouldn't care. That's the real heartbreak. They had something we all wanted to love, and somehow they ruined it. Again, I played this game with no prior knowledge, but to write this review, I did research on Inquisition, the Fade, and Solas. Honestly, that proves my point. The story is too complicated for a game like this. With its length, most players won't play it consistently, making it hard to remember all the details or stay invested. But what do you think? Was I too harsh or too lenient? Let me know in the comments. That's it, Vanoobie out.